Okay, we learned everything about a new era in court administration and court process automation. And now we're going to learn a lot about A to G, access to government. And our moderator for this panel is Stephen Caines. So Stephen was our residential CodeX fellow. Started for 2019, and then through the pandemic, I actually felt really bad for Stephen, and everything shut down. And the beginning of his fellowship was, in the middle of lockdown. And then he spent 2 years with us, and then went on to work in government. Joined the city of San Jose. Where he initially was the Deputy Chief Innovation Officer. Now he's the Chief Innovation Officer of the city of San Jose, where he's driving a lot of important initiatives. He's also the Director of Budget at the city of San Jose. And he's an all-around expert on government technology, and he's kindly agreed to moderate this session. And thank you very much, Stephen, for doing this, and I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Roland. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to FutureLaw 2023. It's so good to see so many familiar faces as well as several new ones as well. We're so happy you could all join us here today. My name is Stephen Caines, and I'm the Chief Innovation Officer and Budget Director for the City of San Jose. I've been fortunate to work in 2 separate mayoral administrations. For those of us who are visiting, San Jose is a city 30 minutes south that is the 10th largest city in the US and also the capital of Silicon Valley. More relevant to this conversation, though, I'm a proud non-residential fellow of CodeX. As Roland stated, my journey with CodeX started in 2019, where I spent 2 years as a residential fellow before transitioning into government. But it's just so good to be back, and before I start, I just want to quickly express some gratitude to the conference organizers as well as the current event staff, who's just doing an amazing job at making sure everything runs smoothly. So before we jump into it, I'd love to just set the table a little bit. Today's panel is titled Access to Government, Government Relationship Management, Revolutionizing the Interaction Between Citizen and Government. So the task of government adequately serving its residents and constituents is a constantly moving target in terms of goals, resources, best practices, expectations, technology, the political climate, and economic conditions. In order to succeed in providing effective government services that make meaningful progress towards closing inequities and improving the quality of life of residents, various conditions must be met. Internally, we must have an adequate and knowledgeable staff, a healthy amount of risk tolerance with adequate safeguards, and open channels of communication with industry as well as the community in order to better understand need and opportunity. A question I frequently get is, Stephen, what even is a Chief Innovation Officer and what exactly do you do? And to be honest, it requires me to wear a great number of hats. Some days it's a policy hat, looking at the ways in which the city is developing and deploying novel technology, such as automated license plate readers to combat the rise in traffic incidents and deaths. And we do this by collaborating with our digital privacy officer to limit uses around sensitive communities, such as the undocumented or people seeking Planned Parenthood type services. Other days I'm wearing a product hat, often supervising teams of students from graduate and undergraduate programs from Stanford, UCLA, Berkeley, in developing different digital services for the city. So a few months ago, we launched the Independent Police Auditor tool, which houses closed investigations into officer misconduct involving sexual assault, excessive force, and dishonesty. And then other days, I'm wearing an advisor hat, so working with senior officials such as the mayor and other senior leaders to advise on certain programmatic issues such as digital inclusion and deciding how are we going to continue to bring revenue into a program to put devices in the hands of our community most needy, such as building our device refurbishment program. In order to succeed externally, however, we need private companies, academic institutions, NGOs, and others who are redefining public service by strengthening our digital infrastructure, or digital sidewalks, as a former colleague would say. Building resilient, representative, and effective systems require us to consider the often dynamic nature in which our communities exist. This includes going beyond addressing basic literacy, language, cultural, and accessibility concerns, and also extends into questions of ethics, consent, privacy, and governance. As the pandemic required us to respond and adapt, there's nearly just as significant and often more gradual change. In some ways, you could call it an unwinding following our exit from this crisis. It is key to note that we are not merely returning to a pre-pandemic world, but rather a new frontier. And while many of us have been impressed by seeing government go beyond previously defined boundaries, whether that's in terms of scaling up food distribution, digital court proceedings, COVID testing, and vaccinations, we're now faced with new challenges. At the local level, one of these biggest issues is the adjustment to the lack of federal funding. Last year, there was historic investment from the federal government into our communities. San Jose alone received $95 million in ARP fundings, and now are making difficult decisions about programmatic sustainability and continuing certain efforts due to these kind of one-time grants. Aside from immediate concerns as well, we need to think about how new generations who will never know a world without a digital front door will be able to access this world. So how can we establish firm regulations, laws, and best practices to ensure that governments improve the quality of life for everyone? And finally, as the world rushes to test and implement generative AI, governments and civil societies are worried less about losing a competitive edge and more about ensuring first mover is not first loser. Today, I would like to address how we can establish a fertile space for government and these other key stakeholders to rapidly, iteratively, and confidently develop a more dynamic and effective government services. Further investment in this area can improve access to justice and move justice for all from a tagline into an actual reality. Additionally, I would like to delve into some of the exciting developments that these wonderful panelists have at their respective home institutions that they've been working on to develop better connective tissue between citizen and government. Our panelists today have made great strides in the areas of immigration, financial services regulation, legal research, and other valuable areas. Now I'll move to panelist introductions, and in the interest of time, I'll just kick off with an initial question after I do the introduction. So I'm going to go a little bit out of order here, but I'll start with Thomas. Thomas Kim joined Thomson Reuters in 1999 as a compliance and legal counsel. Since then, he has held a number of legal executive roles, including chief counsel for Reuters News, business unit general counsel, and as the company's chief compliance officer. Prior to assuming his current role as chief legal officer and company secretary, Thomas led the separation of the $6 billion financial risk and data business, now known as Refinitiv, from Thomson Reuters. Prior to that, Thomas was the managing director of Thomson Reuters business in China, with P&L responsibility for a circa $130 million business. Thomas obtained his undergraduate and law degrees from Stanford University. Good morning, Thomas. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Wonderful. So anyone who is in or even adjacent to the legal space is familiar with Thomson Reuters. They're a true giant in the legal field, and all of their comings and goings would take longer than this fully hour to fully detail. But from this unique vantage point in the field, what are some of the exciting ways that Thomson Reuters is addressing the deficits in our legal system, Thomas?
Well, we heard some really fantastic comments from all of the panelists that preceded us, and then also in the opening welcome from Mark. And I just wanted to sort of follow up on a little bit of that. We talked a little bit about some of the factors in the crisis of justice in America being some of the lack of representation. But even assuming you had representation, or aside from that, one of the other things we haven't talked about, and this maybe goes back to a comment that you said, Stephen, we're not just going to a pre-pandemic world, we're going to a world that's been changed by it. There is a crisis of access to justice even in getting into court, and the delays that are resulted in that. In 2022, Thomson Reuters, along with the ABA, conducted a study on the costs, whether it's the human costs or the financial costs, if you want to be a little bit more, I guess, tactical about it, about the delay to justice. And I just wanted to share a little bit of some statistics, which I sort of really found very, very appalling. We looked at 130 courts in 21 states, and not a single one of them was within the recommended guidelines that the ABA has set forth for the timely delivery of justice, which is resolution of 365 days for felony cases and 180 days for misdemeanors. Now, what does that mean when not a single one of the courts that we looked at out of 180 are even within that time band? There's two different things that are going on. First, if you are someone in the justice system and you are subject to this sort of delayed justice, you are getting a clear signal. And I think this is a message that a number of the other panelists and speakers have talked about. You are getting a signal that the justice system is not for you. It can be incredibly discouraging, especially for those that are underrepresented and unrepresented. I think the second thing is there's a tremendous cost associated with that as well, and the backlog of that. And then I would just finally add, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, it's only been exacerbated by COVID. During COVID, and I have other statistics I can share later, the amount of backlog in all of these courts has really, really multiplied, and that's made it even harder. So we're facing a crisis of access to justice in this country, not only because there are so many people who are unrepresented or underrepresented, but also just because it is incredibly difficult to get into court, to get through court, and get justice through a court.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And the one word that I kind of latched on in that great response was discouraging, and that's really what it is for millions of Americans specifically. And it seems that, one negative interaction with the legal system can snowball into a lifetime of negative perception. And so I think that's why it's important to get things right. But thank you so much, Thomas. We're next going to move to Amelie. Amelie Sophie Viborowski is the founder of Formally, a legal tech startup that uses accessible design to simplify and streamline immigration applications. Amelie and her team built Formally to solve two problems in the immigration space: the lack of legal representation on one hand, and the low rates of success of pro se applications on the other hand. Formerly's innovative software has been celebrated for its accessibility, security, and thoughtful data privacy practices. As a lead graduate researcher at Stanford Digital Society Lab, she manages on the right to freedom, assembly, and association in digital spaces, anti-surveillance, and digital capacity building for nonprofit organizations. Amelie's research focuses on digital human rights in both international and domestic jurisdictions and seeks to bridge the gap between public and private sectors. She's a dual degree graduate at Stanford in tech and cyber policy and sustainable design at Stanford. Good morning, Amelie. How are you?
Doing well. It's so good to be here and so glad to see so many familiar and new faces. It's like a really exciting time.
Absolutely. And, you know, as a friend and a colleague, it's been really exciting to see your company have such great strides in the last few years. Can you share the impetus for Formally and, you know, some of those milestones that you've been happy to check off in the last few years?
Sure. It's been a really fun time for us, but it started with a really uncomfortable realization. So I came to the U.S. as a really privileged immigrant. You know, I still sometimes get held up by Border Patrol for stupid reasons, but I always know I can get out of it. Which is a huge privilege in and of itself, right? But I took a look at the U.S. asylum application, and it's called an I-589, already inaccessible. And then the very first question, I'm going to say it slowly, check this box if you also want to apply for withholding of removal under the Convention Against Torture. This form's only available in English. There's 400 more questions. The question of, like, what's your name is question number 7. It's impossible. It's truly impossible, right? And there are statistics as well, right? The statistic for asylum applications was upwards of 86% of asylum seekers do not have legal representation, which makes them at least 5 times more likely to be denied. We're talking about people's lives. Those are really important cases, right? And I think the more I looked into immigration and the more I looked at the justice system overall, as everyone has said today, there's a huge crisis in terms of people being able to access legal system, in terms of being able to navigate them. So the impetus for Formally started there. But I think the vision grew bigger and bigger as this problem ballooned into a bigger and bigger problem, right? So building a platform that is really data forward, privacy forward, where people are actually in charge of their legal processes and information, that's the vision for Formally. And you know, we've grown the team, we've raised some funding. We're still in the early stages, but we're really excited to tackle this really big challenge.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that introduction to your company. Part of what really resonated with me is just as a first-generation American, I saw my parents apply for, like, you know, legal citizenship within the U.S. and helping them study as a 13, 14-year-old kid just made me realize how deeply flawed the system was even at that age. So thank you for all of your work. Moving to Alex Kachatourian. Alex serves as a director in FINRA's Office of Financial Innovation in Washington, D.C. Alex supports OFI's mission in the identification and analysis of emerging technologies, laws and regulations, business models, and industry practices, both domestic and international, to inform FINRA's risk management and strategy goals. His primary area of focus in recent years has been at the intersection of technology, law, and regulatory compliance. Alex's professional background includes several years of federal government service, law firm practice, and operations within global financial institutions. Alex, how are you doing?
Very well. Good to be here.
Great, thank you. We're really happy to have you here as well. And so, you know, as I was preparing for this, I was really impressed to learn about FINRA and that it operates in almost a quasi-governmental space and that you're not a formal government entity, but you play such a pivotal role in the financial regulation industry. And so, you know, I'm loosely aware that, you know, the mission of it is investor protection and market integrity, but can you speak a little bit more about your organization and specifically your department as well? And
Yeah,
some of your work?
absolutely. Well, first of all, this wouldn't really be a government panel if you weren't to hear these words. The views expressed herein are mine and mine alone. They do not necessarily represent the views and opinions of the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, or FINRA. So, everyone feel comfortable now? Okay, good. So, FINRA, what do we do? Technically, we are a self-regulatory organization, an SRO. In simple terms, that means we can write our own rules. We're statutorily overseen by the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission, the SEC, for oversight of broker-dealers. So what that essentially means is FINRA is really the boots on the ground to go into broker-dealer offices and, you know, look at their books and records, make sure they're following all of the FINRA rules and any relevant SEC rules that pertain to broker-dealers, statutes, other SEC rules as well, right? So, you know, kind of listening to things that have been said earlier today, including you earlier, Stephen, just a few minutes ago, new frontier, not returning to new levels. You know, I'm not sure everyone's experience or knowledge of trends in the financial service industry or brokerage industry. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Robinhood. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the explosion in crypto and the question of whether that's security or not security that's driven by the SEC ultimately. But there are a whole host of issues that we've been looking at. And our field has very much been dramatically impacted by technology. Not to date myself too much, but for me, growing up working with a stockbroker meant driving out to the suburbs, sitting in some office, and some person gives you, some advice and opens up an account or whatever it may be. Or pagers, if anyone remembers those, sending your stockbroker something on a pager, they place an order for you. Well, that's dramatically changed over the last few decades with discount brokerages, online brokerages, if you will. Now I can pull my phone out and place a trade in the middle of this panel if I wanted to. I'm not going to, but anyone could, right? So the entire industry has dramatically changed. The face of it has changed with technology. There's been a whole host of products. And what is our office's role? Well, maybe I'll just take a step back. What is FINRA's role? You nailed the two pillars: investor protection, market integrity. So making sure you all as investors, as individual investors, are protected and not, ripped off, and that the market is functioning properly. So kind of our 5 key drivers. Number 1 is that every investor gets the basic protections that they require, that they deserve. That everyone who sells securities is appropriately licensed, tested, qualified, registered with FINRA. That every piece of marketing for investment is truthful and not misleading. That every investment that is given is suitable for that investor, right? So if you don't have a lot of disposable income, you're low appetite for risk, you're not being sold a knock-in, knock-out option with a short maturity date. And lastly, that proper disclosures are given to investors. So our office's job, as my boss put it, we have the coolest job at FINRA, but also the hardest. The coolest is my job every day is to come in and see, gee, I wonder what's happening today, tomorrow, 5 years from now that might impact or disrupt the securities markets. And my job essentially is to make sure our upper management, our CEO, our general counsel are aware of these trends and informed. And also that all of the examiners, right, we have regional offices across the country. Here on the West Coast, we have LA, San Francisco, Denver, and we have all across the Midwest, the South, the East Coast. We need to make sure that all these examiners who go into these firms are aware of what no-code, low-code software is, or are aware of what the difference between ETH and Bitcoin is, things along those lines. And kind of looking further down the line, understanding what more disruptive types of technologies, 5-10 years away, quantum computing, what is that going to mean for the financial services industry? So there's a lot going on as there is in the world, and there's a lot of focus today on access to justice. I think our focus at FINRA mostly is fair access to financial markets, capital markets.
Great. Thank you so much for that summary, and it's definitely a very interesting futures unit that you work in. And last but certainly not least, here, Argawal. He did his PhD from Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany in 2007 in the area of formal integration of data and processes. From 2007 to 2012, Sudhir continued in the same research group as a postdoc, and in that role, he led several German and EU-funded research projects, as well as taught several undergrad courses. In 2013, Sudhir joined Stanford Logic Group as a visiting scholar, and later as a research staff and CodeX fellow. During his stay at Stanford from 2013 to 2017, Sudhir worked on several projects in the areas of privacy-preserving data integration, open data, database update policies, and computable contracts. In 2018, Sudhir joined Intuit, where he worked on automatic generation of machine interpretable tax calculation rules from IRS documents in English. Sudhir also led a project to help customers minimize their taxes based on mathematical optimization. Currently, as principal research scientist, Sudhir is leading research in the neuroscience symbolic AI unit at Intuit. Good morning, Sudhir. How are you?
Good morning. Great to be here. I'm a big fan of this conference. Thank you, the organizers, for inviting me, and yet another really very well organized episode of this conference. So I'm really looking forward to sharing the technology's perspective, in particular how we are using AI at Intuit, in TurboTax, and in some other situations as well.
Yeah, and thank you for kind of creating a perfect segue for me to my first question. Many of us are obviously familiar with Intuit in terms of TurboTax and all of the other great services that they provide. How is Intuit using AI in their tax experience, and what are the benefits of incorporating AI specifically for customers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, let's take a step back. So the IRS basically publicly makes available all the tax forms, instruction documents, publications in natural language, English in this case. And US taxpayers have been using these documents to file their taxes for years. And in principle, they can take the same approach even today. But for a lay person, it's quite a daunting task to make sure that their tax return is complete. And secondly, that the calculations on the tax return are correct. So this is where the software basically comes to the rescue. Computers can be expected to do 100% correct calculations, but there are still two really big challenges among some more. So the first one is so these two challenges, that's where we basically use AI for. So the first challenge is to create machine executable code or rules, if you like, from the natural language descriptions of thousands of pages of tax rules. And equally important is to keep them up to date because, as you know, a little bit of text changes every year. And the second big challenge is to efficiently collect all the information from the users. So you don't want to ask a user thousands of questions that most of them may not be even relevant for the situation that the particular user is in with respect to the taxes. So you want to ask the user only the relevant questions. So these are the two challenges that we use AI for. So now, doing a click deeper, knowledge engineering is a particular technology within AI that we use for it. So knowledge engineering, for those who may not be familiar with that, is a technology that emulates an expert's behavior and judgment. And so we use knowledge engineering to create or turn thousands of pages of IRS code into machine executable code and keep it up to date, as well as the relationship between the data elements in those documents. And this gives us then a great basis for providing users, the tax filers in this case, a personalized experience with really clear explanations if they like to have explanation of certain calculation. They have full control how much detail they want to go into a certain explanation. For example, how much refund they are getting back, and they can really click through it. And this feels really like a conversation, and that helps ultimately users to build more trust that the calculations are accurate and unique for their personalized situation. And so this is like, I want to mention that the knowledge engineering, the technology I was mentioning, that's a generic technology. It's not tailored to taxes only. So we use, for example, the same technology and same kind of process from the technology and the rules to build a system to provide users this experience. In 2022, in April, if I remember correctly, we launched what we called Intuit Aid Assist, a free website which helps users, small business owners in this case, and self-employed people, to figure out interactively whether they are eligible for relief under the CARES Act. And then they can figure out in this same tool, so in addition to whether they're eligible, they can also figure out how much loan they can they get their loan forgiven, and all these kind of things. So in the same way, TurboTax works, but now the same technology, knowledge engineering, is used for a different kind of application.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction to knowledge engineering. And I can definitely see the benefits of AI, just given the volume of information and rules that must be applied given a certain tax scenario. But great. So now moving on to the second phase of questions, I'd like to dig into some of these specific initiatives that these different panelists have at their home institutions. So first, I'll start with Alex this time. FINRA recently launched a tool named FIRST, which is an acronym, which is an informational tool that is a machine-readable rule book. Currently, it contains a subset of the full rule book, about 40 rules, and it has 3 components. And one, it creates the regulatory taxonomy. 2, it launches the tool. And 3rd, there's an API. Could you tell me a little bit more about the tool specifically, and also how you chose that specific subset of 40 rules?
Yeah, absolutely. So in October of last year, we launched something called a Machine-Readable Rulebook Initiative at FINRA. So that has these 3 components that you mentioned. First, we created an overarching taxonomy to overlay on our rulebook, or a subset therein. Second, we created FIRST. Of course, everything in government is an acronym. FIRST is the FINRA rulebook search tool. It is a bit of a cheeky term in the sense that the idea is it's your first resource when accessing the FINRA rulebook. And why we say that is because we created this taxonomy and we layered it on the rulebook to create a filtering search tool. Crudely put, it's like going on any e-commerce site, right? HomeDepot.com, Macy's.com, right? If you want to buy a bathroom faucet, right? You would, if you search through everything that they sell on HomeDepot.com, you'd be there for years. But you filter through bathroom, you go through fixtures, you click on single handle, you click on delta, you click on under $100, and boom, with those filters or facets, you narrow down your search. Imagine taking that handy tool and applying it to searching the rules that apply to retail customers in the account opening process for Know Your Customer, KYC, or AML obligations. You can take this broad universe and filter it based on these fact patterns and tailor your search. The third component, which really makes it truly machine readable in our view, is the API. So our technology folks created at FINRA, we have a very big technology team. They created an API for the FINRA rulebook that essentially allows you to take all of these taxonomy tags, which we applied as metadata to the subset of 40 rules, and you can pull them in if you subscribe to the FINRA API through our API into a firm's or a RegTech vendor's API, map it to your internal policies and procedures, and perhaps most helpfully, for regulatory change management or regulatory intelligence, however you call it, you get an automated update when any of those tags changes. So if FINRA Rule 3110 on supervision no longer applies to the sales and trading business unit, you will get an automatic update of that change. So how did we land on 40 rules? Well, we have 895 FINRA rules, so we only have 855 left to tag. We picked those 40 because we vetted our whole process. It was basically myself, I'm an attorney, but I sit in the Office of Financial Innovation. I have two colleagues in the General Counsel's office. We basically just sat down and thought of this in a windowless conference room, starting with an Excel sheet. And we created this taxonomy. And I think the reason why we came up with those 40 is because we worked with an external RegTech vendor that creates taxonomies for global firms. We also created a working group of compliance professionals at a range of broker-dealers that are FINRA members. And we tested it with them. We asked them questions. We got their opinions. And they ultimately said, rather than kind of starting sequentially, the 0100 series of the FINRA rulebook, pick the most reviewed FINRA rules, the FINRA greatest hits, if you will. So we checked which of the FINRA rules are most visited on our website. These 40 rules actually represent about half the FINRA rulebook searches. So, there are margin requirements, our supervision requirements, outside business activities, really, the heavy-hitting ones. And where we stand now is we want to know, where do we go next, right? Like I said, we only have 855 rules to go. Well, how are we going to do that? Is it going to be me and my two colleagues, who are great guys? Are we going to meet on the weekends and at nighttime and plug through this? I don't know that that's scalable. Are we going to use an AI tool? Maybe, but I haven't seen one yet that's going to work. If anyone has one, I'm certainly interested. Are we going to take a risk by using an AI tool because we might miss something, right? If we're a regulator and we're putting this taxonomy out there, although we have a disclaimer that this is not legal advice, it might not be interpreted that way. Though these are considerations to have. Do we face an interoperability or harmonization problem, right? I call it the Tower of Babel problem in some ways, right? If FINRA creates their taxonomy, the SEC creates their taxonomy, the China CSRC creates theirs, ESMA in Europe creates theirs, French AMF creates theirs. Is that going to be a challenge, or do you just kind of have to start somewhere? Do we open source it? The FinTech Open Source Foundation, FINOS, they're a subset of the Linux Foundation. They're advocating for that approach. Is that an option? We are very much soliciting input. We had a public comment period, so that's really us engaging with the public. But that comment period closed, but we're still open for ideas and input and thoughts, and this is certainly the right audience to be engaging with. So please reach out to me afterwards or by email. I'm happy to chat.
Nice, great answer. And yeah, I really appreciate that you're thinking so much about the future. And I appreciate you also just giving us a peek into your brain at some of these higher level questions in terms of how are we going to sustain this and maintain the integrity of the tool specifically moving forward. And in that same vein of doing good user research and understanding the problem, understanding what are you trying to solve for, I'd like to turn to Amelie and kind of ask, what are some of the nuances and the challenges that you face as you deal with the immigration system in the US specifically, and how do you design or try to compensate for those issues?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're all unique to the immigration system. Immigration is actually, to some extent, a more comfortable space because it's a federally regulated process. So I don't have to deal with what Mark was showing, which is like each court might have a different form. Like, no, we know which forms you need to fill out. I think what's still really difficult for people is to understand their options. I think there's a lot of bad information. There's a lot of lack of information. Like, there's a lack of information as well. So helping people understand their options is a really key thing. And then there's also just challenges with, I think someone else said that, right? Like, we can't really fix the backlog that people have on green cards. I think some people wait like upwards of a decade for a green card just because there's some really, really bad backlogs with USCIS. So there's things that are tough to fix with technology, things that are easier to fix with technology. I certainly don't think it's a silver bullet. But things you can do, for instance, and things you can actually tackle, is you can ask better questions that make more sense to human beings, right? You can try to eliminate redundant work as much as possible, right? So you can make sure, similar to what you said earlier, Sudhir, you can only ask questions once, and you can make sure that the questions you ask are actually relevant. So I think right now what we're really doing is building really great workflows on top of not so great government workflows, right? So that's really the beginning of the magic. And then within those workflows, you can do more interesting things, right? All data on our platform is fully portable. So as somebody who's really interested in privacy, that's something I'm really interested in, right? Like, who did you share your most important PII with? And do you still want to share it with those people? Can you bring it with you to your next process, right? We know that for immigration, for instance, most people go through 7 or 8 processes. So they're going to need that data again. So those are some things we're thinking about. And then, we are also thinking about, like, I did a lot of research at Stanford HAI, which is the Center for Human-Centered AI, on like where AI actually makes sense in the legal system. And I'm in the camp that if it's wrong 1% of the time, that's too much. Because these are really important, really, really important processes, and these are people's lives, right? So a 1% failure to give good, sound advice, I think is too low. That being said, I think there are ways where it makes sense, right? So immigration, for instance, is full of needs to draft documents that are drafted by non-lawyers, right? So support letters for, like, I'm on an O1A visa. I had to write like 13 letters, and thank you, Roland, for signing one of them. Like 13 letters of why I'm an extraordinary alien, which is so funny to begin with, but obviously, I know, alien over here. So obviously this is a great task for AI, right? I can say, I'm a fellow at CodeX. Like, write me a letter from the perspective of Roland, who is the director of the center. And that makes a ton of sense, right? So we have already started to do prompt engineering to help people get past the blank page, or for managers who need to provide like job descriptions for H-1Bs. And then I think the other area where AI is interesting currently for legal processes is in internal knowledge management for law firms. I think law firms really struggle to find good information and good templates and to like really manage their internal knowledge bases. So that's another area where through this collaboration platform that we're building, you can do some really exciting things. So, I don't know, this is my like not so sexy answer, like nuanced answer to where does AI make sense in immigration? Where do you think you can make the immigration process better? But I think the right direction is like secure, portable data, accessible design, seamless collaboration, and then AI where it makes sense.
Great, yeah, and thank you for that answer. I thought that was pretty eye-opening, and it's interesting too that it is, since it is a federal space, it's a little bit more straightforward. But yeah, definitely, there's definitely a Venn diagram between immigration and talent specifically, as we all know. That's one thing that the U.S. potentially threatens to be reduced in terms of the brain power we have to tackle a lot of these issues. One thing, now turning to Thomas, one thing that I was really impressed by while I was preparing for this panel was not only your amount of formal roles specifically, whether it be the chief compliance officer, chief legal officer, and company secretary, but also the amount of work that you've done outside of the office. So Thomas sits on the advisory council of the law firm Anti-Racism Alliance and the board of directors of the National GC Network, BIPOC Lawyers Leading the Way. He also received the Justice in Action Award from the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund and was a keynote honoree of the Korean American Lawyers Association of Greater New York. I'd read off a few other awards, but at the risk of embarrassing you there. I would just love to know, as government seeks to fortify our pool of talent, what are some methods or techniques you've used to get the right people in the right place for the right role?
Wow, that's a great question, which you did not give me a heads up on. I think it's for those people in the room, there's lots of different things that motivate us to do different things. I mean, some of us are people who love to solve a problem. We see a challenge, our mind clicks into gear, and we want to solve that. And I think a lot of the things that Amelie Sophie and I think also George Simons mentioned earlier these are complex problems that somebody should crack. And there is a justice element to it as well, but there's sort of both of those. I think other instances, they are more motivated by that second part, which is the greater injustice of it all. So, you mentioned the law firm Anti-Racism Alliance, and I think over the last couple of years, and again, Stephen, going back to we are not reverting to a pre-COVID world, we should also not forget that during that same period of time, we had the murder of George Floyd. And I certainly think for those of us in corporate America and those of us as lawyers, the world that we currently exist in today is different than it was in 2019. If I was to have asked you in 2019 to go to leading law firms or to go to corporations and make them answer a simple question of, do we have institutional racism in the United States? You would probably have not gotten any answer. Now, whether it's, performative, sort of social advocacy or whether it's true, most people would say yes, and there's a problem that we need to solve. So I think there's a role for so many different people to play in this space where technology, innovation, law, regulation all combine, that there can be a multitude of different things that bring you there. And for many people, it's a combination of all of that. And I think it's very, very exciting, but also at the same time, in the prep call you and I were discussing, one of the things that I have been thinking about recently is also all the things that can be really revolutionary about what all of the people in this room are trying to do can also be used for bad purposes. And when you think about technology innovation and access to government, a lot of it actually could begin with a benevolent purpose in mind, but could be misused by government actors or by governments for bad purposes. And so I think it's also incumbent on people to not only trying to drive positive change to improve situations, but to make sure when we're opening up that sort of solution, we don't create a channel so wide that it creates a larger problem. And I think, Amelie Sophie mentioned something about data portability, which is a perfect example around that. So I think there isn't a simple solution to the question, or a simple answer to the question you asked about how do you get the right people in. But I think one of the themes that was mentioned by earlier panels and speakers was if we can expose the problems and make it more transparent and get as many people as possible, including innovators and technologists, into the situation, we're going to be much better off than if we have a closed system where no one can access it and no one can try to improve it.
Absolutely. That was a great answer, so I appreciate you allowing me to ambush you there. But yeah, I really appreciate that comment, kind of that if you want to make institutional change, sometimes that cultural shift has to occur first, or at least one of the very early steps. So thank you for those comments. And yeah, turning back to here, reading your profile, I definitely get that you have the heart of a researcher, and so I'd love to hear what are some of your research goals and some of the progress you made with the neurosymbolic AI unit. I know you touched on some of the knowledge engineering aspects previously, but I'd just love to give you a larger floor.
It's my favorite topic. I love talking about research. So, so my formal education, I was mostly doing symbolic AI, so the more, good old school style, expert systems, building the rules and, building the rule engines on top of that. And then later on, I started looking at ML, machine learning, and then I started playing with it a little bit, and then I kind of observed that none of these two things are perfect. Both have their pros and cons. So is it possible to combine the best of both worlds? So that's what neurosymbolic AI, I mean, it's not my idea, it's been there before as well, but I'm just telling you about how I came to it. So now at a high level, neurosymbolic AI is about combining the best of both worlds. And now there is no single way of combining these two techniques. It depends on the use case. For example, if your use case requires or has a lot of mathematical calculations and logical reasoning, and you want to make sure that they are really 100% correct, then you're better off with an architecture where the symbolic component has the main control, and you use the machine learning component more as the assisting components for doing the tasks like pattern recognition, where the machine learning is better at. And on the other hand, if the use case requires, something where you want to achieve higher accuracy and higher confidence on things that machine learning is good at, then you would want to have machine learning as the main component, and then have the symbolic component feed into it with logical inferences to improve the confidence and accuracy. So now to give a more concrete example of what we recently did, and that paper got accepted at NeurIPS last year in November. So what we did was, if you have, let's say, unlabeled data, and let me give an example for those who may not be familiar with that terminology. So suppose you have handwritten images of digits, and you don't know what digit these images actually represent. So you have an image of a 5 and an image of a 7, and the task is to train a model that can detect the digits. But you don't have in your data the labels of those digits. But the only thing you know is the sum of those two digits, in this example, 12. Now, 12 can be there are multiple combinations that can sum up to 12. But there is this one is only 5 and 7. So if you have a lot of training examples like that, how would you do that? So with a pure machine learning approach, since you don't have the labels, it doesn't work so well. But when you combine it with symbolic, then the symbolic component can help you compute the combinations that sum up to 12. And then you can use those combinations as, so to speak, the soft labels, as a replacement of the labels that were not there in the first place. Now, the previous approaches before our paper, they took this approach, but in a way that led to a combinatorial explosion, because they computed all the constraint-satisfying combinations, and as the number of digits increase, it increases exponentially, and ultimately, then it doesn't scale. And looking at from the industry perspective, scalable solutions are simply, and that don't scale are just simply not good, because in industry you really have very large kind of situations. So what we did in the paper, we came up with a technique that avoids this combinatorial problem in the first place, and that's why it scales much better than the previous approaches. So yeah, so we are. I'm still excited about the possibilities that neurosymbolic AI has, in particular, also in connection with this recent technology of large language models, and I think there are also a lot of potential of neurosymbolic AI in that space.
Great, thank you so much for detailing some of that work, and definitely I really appreciate the nuanced example of kind of how do you compensate for gaps in your data specifically by going through this process. That's great. So yeah, moving on to the next set of questions specifically. So going back to Alex, we've seen massive fervor and interest around the regulation of cryptocurrency in the last few years. And as many celebrity influencers or marketers are finding out, enforcement actions may be delayed, but they are very real. I'm not going to ask you to comment on that at all. But what are some of the long-term challenges you individually see on the on the financial regulation horizon specifically?
Yeah. So on crypto, I mentioned it earlier as well. Ultimately, whether something is or is not a security, that's a gating question that the SEC makes. That's not a FINRA determination. But we do monitor whether, for example, our member firms are heavily invested in certain cryptocurrencies just because of capitalization issues and the extreme volatility that you've seen. We are interested in different products that may resemble securities, because any firm that's selling securities, they would fall within our ambit. So really where we come into play is, as what you're saying in a lot of these instances, folks should be registered and maybe they're not. So that's where some of the questions come up. On the crypto side, we've released a report on DLT several years ago, and some of the key questions, I won't go into all of them, but are custody. There are specific rules on holding custody, holding cryptocurrencies. How is that done on a blockchain? There are there's some advancements in that space, but that's certainly an open question. And I think just the gating question of whether something is or is not a security, that's very much looming large, and we'll wait for the SEC and the CFTC as well to comment on that. In terms of other spaces that we're looking at, like I said, our office, we have a cool job, but a difficult one in that we have to kind of put our fingers out in the air and see what's blowing in the wind and what might impact us. So in present day things, what are impacting us, not only new products that are coming out, exchange traded funds, et cetera, but also I mentioned this shift from stockbrokers to online brokers. Now you moved from that to zero commissions. Zero commission brokers opened up the securities industry a whole lot. In addition to that, you have gamification that's very, very prevalent in the financial services industry. So yeah, really just bringing addictive qualities and turning financial services into an app-based game where it attracts a whole new set of investors. Looking a little bit further down the line, two sort of pet projects that I'm digging into right now are quantum computing. So we're not experts, obviously, on quantum computing, but we want to put something out there. Hopefully we'll have something out there soon, just to explain to our membership and the public, hey, this is what a quantum computer is. In broad strokes, it's a super, super fast computer, and the reason why you should be worried about it, why everyone should be worried about it, is it could potentially crack all of the encryption, as we know, like that. Or on the other side, firms can use it to seek alpha or do portfolio risk management, do trading in much faster ways. Another area, which maybe some folks here are familiar with, is the metaverse. So as we're moving to a new digital milieu, if you will, some broker-dealers have gotten involved in the metaverse. Mostly it's from a superficial standpoint, but to say something that might grab your attention, it's hard enough to know who your customer is in this day and age. How do you know who it is if it's a digital avatar of a hippopotamus in a volcano world or something, right? How do we know that? That freaks a lot of our member firms out. They don't want to hear it, but we may very well be moving into that type of world. And how do you understand what that world is if that's where we're going to be in 10, 15, 20 years? And I haven't even touched on NFTs and how those might be driving those types of economies. So those are just a couple of the things we're looking at, but there's many more.
Yeah, definitely a lot to look out for. I think I really appreciate how not only the conversation is evolving from in terms of just is this legal or not, but also what would the average person with an average amount of education experience while dealing with these financial services. I really appreciate those kind of advanced discussions as well. Next, I'd like to return back to Thomas. So Thomson Reuters plays a pivotal role in the legal industry, as we previously discussed, and I really appreciate how you've kind of painted the picture of the positive sunny day of things going well, and also the potential dangers of people misusing a lot of these technologies and apparatus. And I'd just love to know from your perspective, what can individuals and organizations do to steer this toward the more positive outcome where there's an increase in access to justice and the government-citizen relationship continues to improve? What can we do, I guess, as individuals that are legal professionals and also at an organizational level?
Yes, so I would mention, interestingly, this is my last week at Thomson Reuters, so next week I'll be the general counsel of Gartner. And so sort of wearing like a Thomson Reuters hat and then a Gartner hat, I'd like to look at this problem in two different ways. I think as lawyers, we tend to be very point solution type people, and we're looking at that perspective. But I think a number of people here have already mentioned something that I think is a better way to look at it, which is larger ecosystems of organizations and government bodies in particular really require a larger platform approach to trying to solve this problem. Because if, for example, if Amelie Sophie was just focused on immigration and said, this is the only way to address this problem here, there may be some people who are also interested in immigration who would be supportive, but it wouldn't have enough support to actually drive governments to do anything, but, well, I'm just guessing, about it. But if you could make an argument to a government that there was a platform way of looking, for example, at digital wallets and virtual identities for citizen customers, and that could be scaled across all of the different touch points that a government body has with people, and that this could be adopted by all municipalities in a state or all by state governments, then you can get a real scale benefit that then would also drive real value in terms of savings, which then you could use to get the budget to afford to do that. And at the same token, if you had that kind of platform approach, then you would eliminate some of this, Tower of Babel problem that Alex mentioned, and you could really have an area where more innovators, more technologists, more technology vendors could get into that and deploy solutions that not only have a specific point application, let's say in immigration or in debt relief, but could actually be applied across the whole suite. So I am hoping that in the next couple of years, we will get to the point where we can convince government bodies to take more of a platform approach to this. And I think the problems that I just mentioned are not things that are in the far future. They're actually here today. And, I spent a lot of this week, at my current job and then also chatting with other people in the area here about all the great work that people are working on right now, which is wonderful, but also really terrifying, because I don't think as much thought is going into this point that, you and I had discussed, Stephen, about how do we make sure that we safeguard people's identity and the choices that they want. Data portability is great if it's your choice, but that can also give someone else the access to take your data and hijack it. And so I'm hoping that we can race a bit ahead of it a little bit and get to some larger platform-like solutions that can be applied across the board.
Yeah, they could hijack it with a bow on it for sure. But yeah, thank you so much for that answer. And I definitely appreciate, we should start migrating away from solving one problem and try to solve a family of problems at once so we can kind of really scale our impact in these different areas. But wonderful. Awesome. So returning to Sudhir, there's been a lot of talk about ChatGPT and also generative AI. I know that you've previously mentioned that in some of your earlier comments, but how do you see this really impacting the tax filing space as an individual, like writ large?
Yeah, well, generative AI is amazing. It can really do very impressive things. So we already use this to some extent in chat conversations and call summarizations, like calls in the sense of when customers call in when they have a question. And some of the potential future use cases of generative AI, as we see into it, could be in the context of answering users' questions, as well as empowering our network of experts to work more efficiently. Having said that, we think that as we see LLM or let's say as an example GPT-4 as of today, we think it needs more maturity. So for example, it has to be logically consistent in its responses. So I give you an example of this. So just 2 weeks ago, I was playing with GPT-4, and I asked a very simple question: is Barack Obama older than Hillary Clinton? And the answer was yes. And Barack Obama was born in August 61, and Hillary Clinton was born in October 47 or something. So I was like, wait a minute, then the answer should have been no then, right? So that is the logical inconsistency. So it's not about having the correct fact. That's also another issue. But regardless of whether the date of births are correct or not, the answer in itself is just not logically consistent. And if a human talks like this with you, then you really have a problem in building a trust in that conversation. So in that sense, so for example, in TurboTax Live, so we build the TurboTax Live for those who know it probably. So that's where you file your taxes with the help of an expert. And and that really helps to address one of the really big problems that our customers had, which was lack of confidence. So if you file your taxes yourself, some people were not sure whether they did it right or not, and so they wanted to have experts' assistance there. So we think that the GPT-4, as of today, it does not have the capability to replace such experts fully as of now. We will see what happens in the future.
Got it. Thank you for that assessment. And yeah, definitely troubling if it gets that question wrong. But yeah, moving to Amelie for our last question before we open it up to Q&A for everybody. I know that we've spoken at depth how formally it's not just an immigration company, it's a secure legal collaboration platform. And as you think about that identity, how does also the future of generative AI also weave into that as well? And anything that you're excited about?
Yeah, I think, thank you, first of all, Thomas, for queuing up my points so well. I totally agree that there needs to be a platform solution. I think it's really hard to just say we're going to solve all of government and all of the government interactions and processes without focus first, right? I think there's a huge risk of becoming nothing to everyone, right? So when we were looking at a big problem to solve, first of all, I care deeply about immigration. I think you can tell. But I think another good reason to do it is that immigration is a repeatable process. Not very many legal processes are repeatable for consumers. So it makes sense to start somewhere where it is repeatable. And then we also need to start somewhere where we had two more issues. One is it needed to be a collaboration process, right? So you needed more than one stakeholder. So we needed to build a platform that works for multi-stakeholder collaboration. Again, immigration is a great example, right? It needs to work for the employer, it needs to work for the employee, it also needs to work for the lawyer that works with them. And the lawyers have legal teams and companies have HR teams, and there's like lots of stakeholders, right? So that's a good challenge to tackle. And then the last thing is, if you want to build a true platform that is based on portable data that people have ownership over, you need some general data about people, right? Like you need like your name, probably your social security number, passport. Immigration is full of PII, for better or for worse. I mean, I don't think USCIS needs all that data in full, candidness, but it is really generalizable and generalizable data. And I just don't see a world where someone would just sit down for no particularly good reason and put all their PII into a system, right? So as I designed this system, I'm thinking about all these different things, and as my team thinks about the security of it and how to give users as much choice and as many options as possible, something I'm really excited about is this idea of building policy knowledge. So I'm a policymaker by training, so building some policy knowledge into Formally as a platform, right? So, hey, we noticed you applied for asylum. We think you may also meet the eligibility requirements for an employment authorization and a fee waiver. We used your existing information to make a first draft. Would you like to send it to your attorney for review, right? That takes out structural barriers in a much more powerful way, because one of the biggest challenges with policy solutions is the people that policies are supposed to help are often not aware of them, and they don't know how to access them, and they don't know that they should be looking for something that is they don't know they should be looking for a fee waiver, right? So if you can actually do what I call last mile policy delivery for individuals, and if you can build better systems that have awareness of which form you need to file and where and what you're eligible for, then I think you can do a lot of good in terms of delivering justice to citizens who really in the end need it. And that's, I think, where I see a lot of excitement. I think generative AI is exciting. I think it makes sense in certain places. I don't think it makes sense in other places. But if we can really crack how people navigate legal systems more effectively, then I think we can do a lot of good.
Great, awesome, great answer. And I think it ties in with what you were saying earlier, just about providing options. And the most difficult decision is the one that you're not even presented with clearly.
Right.
So, yeah, that all resonated with me. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'll open it up to questions right now. I think we can fit in probably 2 or 3, potentially. Sir? And sorry, can we get him a microphone by chance? Oh, great.
Does that work? Hello. Sorry. My name is Georg Ringe. I'm a professor of law and finance. Sorry, my voice is cracking. I have a question to Alex. So you started by describing this machine-readable rulebook that you're creating. I was wondering whether in perspective you can also see future steps building this one-way interpretation to more dialogue between you as supervisors and then financial industry, so that, for example, submissions of firms or reporting can be done automated, and then you as supervisors can also read and analyze those data that are coming in automatically, so that it's not just becoming a one-directional road, but sort of automated dialogue between you as supervisors and the firms that you're supervising. So maybe you can say a word or two on the efforts that are going into that direction.
Sure. So the first answer is we're open to everything, and we're listening, and we want to build the best possible and most useful tool. That's the bottom line. At this point right now, we haven't built something for, I hear that, I'm thinking digital regulatory reporting. That's something the Bank of England and UK FCA are working on. Computational law, rules as code, machine executable rules. That's not what our tool is, but it is a crucial initial step or building block to getting towards that future. In terms of kind of more near-term input that we're taking, we have put the public comment out. We are inviting people to come and talk to us and tell us what they want. And ultimately, we're collecting all of those comments, like formal, informal, what have you, and we're taking that up to our senior leadership, and we're going to strategize on how to best build out the tool. So you saying what you just said is very helpful for us to hear, even if that's definitely not what our tool is right now, but I think it builds a pathway towards that. I do believe that. So I hope that helps.
Great, thank you so much. I think we're going to have one more question. Go with Jay.
Hi, Jay Mundell, fellow here at CodeX. I have a question. As you know, there's a Cambrian explosion of these AI startups that are attacking verticals, and government happens to be one of them. So I was curious from Stephen, your perspective, and also Alex's perspective, where do you see, because there has to be a handshake with the regulators as to where there is going to be some level of innovation. Where do you see some openings for AI and government sort of vertical sort of startups that could emerge in your space? And then secondly, what areas do you think these startups should be aware of from the regulatory side that maybe people in the room could help address to make sure it's a smoother transition into these new areas of innovation?
Definitely a great question. I'm going to defer to Alex first, and then I'll answer after.
So I mean, there's certainly a lot there. I think the first thing that we thought of, and I'm just going to talk about generative AI. I mean, there's a lot there with AI. We did put out an AI report in 2020 talking about all the possible use cases and risks, customer outreach, marketing, things along those lines, how firms are using AI, and it's happening a lot. Broker-dealers using AI for user interface and outreach. On the ChatGPT side, I'm not positive that's exactly where you're going. The first thing that we identified as a risk is data leak. You saw I think the government of Italy came out, and I think some parts of Canada came out banning use of ChatGPT. First concern we had when our cyber team got involved was, taking sensitive information, whether it's customer information or market data information, putting that into a ChatGPT tool and having it leaked. So right now we're looking around the kind of regulatory perimeter, the defenses, and some of the potential risks. As far as better understanding that marketplace, that's what our office is for. So we can talk offline if you want to engage in some of the things that you think we should be focused on, or get a better sense of what FINRA generally is looking at, because I'm not our AI expert. We have a whole host of cyber and AI folks that can discuss that in greater detail. But we're an initial point of contact.
Yeah, and just to quickly add, because I know we're already over time, I'd say one thing that we've been kind of thinking about a little bit, mulling over, and I'll say this actually as an individual, not as a group, but the notion of like policy research in terms of generative AI has definitely been floated. There's obviously the high risk of accuracy that Sudhir clearly realized, and you don't want to kind of perpetuate certain issues, but just the whole volume of information that one city alone can potentially process in one calendar year, for instance, can often be intimidating to new policy research specifically joining the team. And so we have kind of thought about that, but the accuracy definitely is something that would take at least another 5 years, I think, potentially, to reliably make decisions on. There's also the issue that you could pretend to be a policy expert, right? Potentially with ChatGPT. In actuality, you may not actually know anything, right? So there's also that risk of, at what point in the career of a policy professional is it right to use that tool at that full scale? I'd argue not very early on, because you may not learn the chops to be able to develop these skills, and also the trade secrets that Alex highlighted specifically to are obviously a big risk. You don't want to enter confidential information about residents or a group potentially into these systems. But there are some interesting public safety applications that we can definitely talk about offline as well. But great question, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this panel.
Great. And yeah, thank you, Stephen, for running a great session. It's really fantastic. And thank you to all the panelists. Thank you so much.